Hello, my lovely listeners. I'm Dr. Mary Barson.
And I'm Dr. Lucy Burns. Welcome to this episode of Real Health and Weight Loss. Good morning, lovely listeners. Dr. Lucy here. And today I'm here to interview one of my favourite doctors, Dr. Liz Fraser. Liz is the co-convener of Low Carb Canberra. Welcome to the podcast, Liz.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm very honoured to be here.
Well, I've got to tell you, you were one of the first people on my list when I went, right, Mares, we're going to actually start talking to other people. And part of the reason for that is Liz is a little like my twin. She's a GP, a long-standing GP, but lives in Canberra. And the superpower that she has that I don't is her ability to read scientific literature and translate it into words that certainly I can understand and hopefully other lay people can. So Liz, what I'd like to ask you and what I'd love for you to tell our listeners is, how did you get into low carb? Tell us your story.
Well, how far do we go back? I first did a low carb diet at the age of 17. I was somewhat anorexic and desperate to lose weight, while my mother was overeating and obese and desperate to lose weight. And this was 1978, and Robert Atkins was in vogue. And I think the thing that probably saved me was that actually I was eating protein and not completely starving myself. I then flipped into binge eating, and I've been through vegetarian for 5 years. In fact, you may not know this, but I ran a vegetarian restaurant for 2 of those years. I've eaten an awful lot of tofu in my life. Then I developed some neurological symptoms in 2009, and I did the fail-safe low salicylate, low amine diet, which kept those symptoms at bay for a while. I then developed an autoimmune disease, and a couple of years later had a relapse. And by that point, I was, I guess, looking around, especially in the complementary medicine sphere, for dietary approaches, because really I'm not very keen on prescribing. Yes, I'm a GP, I'm trained to prescribe, but I guess I'm happiest when I'm not prescribing. And I did something called the GAPS diet, gut and psychology syndrome diet, and that is actually a low carb, high-fat diet. And what happened the day I stopped having porridge for breakfast, I stopped farting.
That's just making me giggle.
Yeah. I stopped being hungry by 10:30 every morning. I used to have, by then I had been gluten-free for a while, but I had quinoa biscuits made with sugar, but it was quinoa, it was gluten-free.
Of course, and quinoa, if it's with quinoa, it's healthy. It's got to be
absolutely
healthy, right?
Yeah. But I stopped being hungry by 10:30, and the third thing, my thyroid antibodies dropped for the first time in months. And look, I didn't get everything that I wanted from doing that particular style of low carb, but it was my first introduction. Then I faffed around with sort of a paleo-ish approach for a while. When I was trying to look into some dietary approaches, I have a patient with Parkinson's disease. Look, this lady is a welded-on ethical vegan, but in thinking about what might help her, I stumbled across an interview, Mike Mutzel, with a guy called Bill who had severe Parkinson's of many years standing, and he was using ketogenic diet and ketone supplements, and that got me looking at the ketogenic diet. And this was April, and about 2 weeks before Low Carb Down Under in Sydney, and that was my first introduction that May Low Carb Sydney day. And I was just completely astounded to hear people like Dr. Paul Mason, Dr. Doron Scher, Dr. Rod Taylor, there was Jessica Turton there, Marianne DeMazy, talking about this stuff. And I really got that this is evidence-based. And I'd been reading a lot of the science about vitamins and minerals and nutrition, and I made the shift into reading the science about low carb, and I haven't looked back. I guess I went looking for something for me, but what I came up with was something for my patients, because as a GP, what I see in general practice over and over again is metabolic syndrome. It's everywhere. People may not officially meet the criteria, but there's a lot of high blood pressure, there's a lot of insulin resistance, there's a lot of overweight and obesity. You'd be familiar with all of this.
Totally.
And it's not just those 5 official criteria, or the dyslipidemia, the high triglycerides and the low HDL. It's also the osteoarthritis. It's the risk of cancer. It's the cognitive problems. What I've been reading recently from people like Nick Norwitz and Dr. Chris Palmer is that mental health is closely linked with metabolic health, and you change people's diets and they feel better.
You know what? And it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? That everything, you look at our current, whilst we're not starving to death, we are nutritionally deficient in probably the most overweight bodies we've ever had. And I think our society blames our mental health on multiple things, disconnection and perhaps our busy lives. But in fact, we've always had busy lives, just different sorts of busyness. But the thing that has definitely changed is the way that we process and eat our food.
Absolutely. I did a talk about this recently for our Low Carb Canberra Meet in March Day. And I don't think there's any one cause of a mental or emotional distress. And we're talking about the high prevalence disorders, anxiety and depression. And my personal experience is that I spent an awful lot of years in therapy and I worked very hard. When I started eating more meat, in particular, I noticed that it was a lot easier being me and a lot easier to implement all that stuff that I had learned in therapy. And I didn't need to work so hard at that emotional self-care. So I think our brains are giant chemical factories. I think the chemical factory story, this story about neurotransmitters, there's a lot of truth to it, but it's not just antidepressants which are going to make the difference. I've certainly seen antidepressants make a difference for people, but I've also seen people turn around taking combinations of such as zinc, magnesium, B6 and vitamin C, for example. I know that when I started doing that back in about 2012, it certainly seemed to switch my brain back on. But I think protein is so important because it provides amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of neurotransmitters. And without those amino acids and neurotransmitters, and without the enzymes that drive the transformation of amino acids into neurotransmitters, our brains struggle. We can't think clearly. We've got low energy. And I've seen a number of people, particularly women, who are not eating terribly much meat and they have low energy. And I tell them, I really think you need to eat more meat. And they come back a while later and say, actually, you were right. You've probably experienced this.
And it's hard for people because there is a lot of messaging around meat being terrible for the world, terrible for each person and terrible for the environment. And I mean, certainly there's plenty of evidence to debunk that myth. And Mary and I did one of our episodes was There Is No Perfect Human Diet, that people get wedded, the ideology and the absolute extreme to which somebody identifies their diet as part of themselves. So if you criticise a particular diet, they feel they're being criticised. Meat is one of the most intense forms of nutrition. I think that's the message I've been getting, is that we only hear about the bad things that meat may or may not do. Nobody actually tells you meat is a nutritionally dense product with a wonderful source of amino acids and a wonderful amount of vitamins and minerals.
And healthy fats as well. We don't need to get our knickers in a twist about the fats in meat. Eat the fat on your chop and enjoy it.
Yes. Our formula, really, we have a very simple formula. We prioritise protein. We call it build a plate. You pick your protein. You then pick a couple of veggies. Again, you don't have to have 20,000. A couple will do. You then add, if your meat is lean, you add some fat. If your meat's not lean, so if you're eating pork belly, well, then you don't need to add more fat. Enough is enough. And then you add some flavour, which usually includes some salt. What are your thoughts on salt, Liz?
At Low Carb Canberra 2020, we had Jessica Turton give a talk about salt. And that was very eye-opening. I have at times really craved salt, and I understand that that's got something to do with what alternative practitioners would call adrenal fatigue. And I now add salt to my water. I enjoy salt on food. Some people are shocked by the amount of salt that I add. And I also add salt to water, and a good quality salt often has lots of other minerals in it. And I think that's another important source of an overlooked source of minerals. From what I understand, the optimal sodium intake is probably around 4 to 6 grams daily, and that's actually just sodium, and salt is approximately half sodium and half chloride. So in fact, we could probably have between 1 and 2 teaspoons of salt daily, and it's not going to do us any harm. My understanding is the NH and MRC very quietly increased its minimum recommended sodium intake to 2 grams and acknowledged that there was no evidence that below 2 grams daily of sodium is a bad thing. And I have seen somewhere a U-shaped curve suggesting that that optimal sodium intake is somewhere around the 4 to 6 grams daily. I'm not into counting. I don't count macros. I don't count grams of salt. I just do it by intuition and trust that my body knows what it wants. And quite frankly, it wants salt.
Totally. And you know what, you've just hit the nail on the head there, is listening to your body. And when we particularly remove the hyperpalatable junk food that, hijacks our brain, when we've got that out of the way, we have this amazing kind of space to be able to listen to what our body needs. And I remember one day, and this was a tiny bit weird because I don't eat a lot of lettuce. Lettuce isn't up there in my favourite foods. But there was this one day where I was at work and I just had this absolute craving for lettuce with some smoked salmon and some cream cheese. And I wrapped them up like a little cigar or a little wrap and crunched into it. I've never had it since, but there was obviously something about that combination that my body needed. I hadn't seen an ad. It hadn't popped in from any other sort of source. It was just me listening to my body and then giving it whatever it was that it needed. So I was happy about that.
Yeah. I'll tell you a story about lettuce. I'm a gardener and I grow my own food. And I guess for a long time, at least some of my own food, I don't think it's really practical to grow everything. But for a long time, a goal has been to grow as many vegetables as I can. And I have lettuce at a certain time of year. I've got lettuce, serious case of lettuce.
You're the lettuce queen.
And I do enjoy a big salad drizzled in an olive oil vinaigrette, sort of lots of vinegar and things chucked in it, cheese and pine nuts and various other things. And what I've observed actually is that's not very filling. I can eat a great big salad and it doesn't fill me up, whereas I eat meat and cheese. If I base a meal around meat and cheese, I actually get satiety from that. And that's a little bit weird. I had 4 days down the coast by myself recently, just as a proof of concept. I did almost total carnivore during that time and was really surprised to find how filling it was, having meat, seafood, or, I had a choice of things, oysters, prawns, various kinds of cheese. I had a large lump of brisket, and I was doing a lot of walking, and I just wasn't that hungry, which was interesting.
It is. It's magnificent that protein and fat satiety signaling that happens. And the thing, I think, that when we have carbs in our diet, we're using volume. So nobody serves, you don't get like 4 pieces of penne at the bottom of your thing. We've got a giant bucket of penne with a little bit of bolognese sauce on top. People think that's really filling and that they're bulking it up with the carbs, but it's just volume, and it's the equivalent of adding air to cream and thinking it's making it bigger.
And it's going to leave you hungry a couple of hours later, as after that insulin spike and your blood glucose plummeting. And that's basically what I found. I cut the carbs out and experienced much less hunger. And, I've also eaten an awful lot of legumes in my life, and I love a good red lentil dal. The problem was that you eat a lot of it, or I ate a lot of it, and I just would end up feeling bloated and kind of a bit of indigestion. And that's far less common, basing my meals around that, prioritizing protein and having some vegetables and the low-carb vegetables and some appropriate kind of fat.
Oh, totally. And this is one of the, we often talk about non-scale victories, and certainly reduction in IBS symptoms, which again is another world phenomenal increase between, we were talking earlier about obesity and arthritis and hypertension, but you've also got to look at all the gut things that are increasing, particularly IBS and reflux. It's crazy. And when you change the diet, when you reduce all of those fermenting carbs and the enormous amount of fibre that we are often eating, a lot of that goes away.
Yep. I think IBS is actually just carbohydrate intolerance, and you would be familiar with the whole FODMAPs concept, and you mentioned the fermentable carbohydrates. A lot of people lament not being able to have those things, and all that stuffing around with FODMAPs and can I eat this and can I eat that. A bit rudely talk about this, said, why don't you just welcome the fact that, hey, your gut is telling you that you can't eat those carbohydrates. Just get rid of them, don't worry about them, and focus on the things that you can eat, which are going to fill you up, which are yummy, which are going to keep you satisfied, and stop worrying about the fact that how many berries am I allowed to have, or how much of this, how much wheat before I get symptoms. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yearning for some poison is what people are doing. And it's easier if you actually just stop yearning. It does make life so much easier. Liz, tell me about Low Carb Canberra.
Well, at some point I was looking around for people to work with, and I had a conversation with a couple of women, and we were thinking we might run a session for lay people. We thought we'd be lucky if we got 20 or maybe 50 people. And then I met Tracey Kimberley, and Tracey is the very passionate mum of a young woman with type 1 diabetes, and that's what drives her. is trying to get the message out there so that people don't have to struggle. And we talked about having a Low Carb Canberra event in 2019, and we did, and it was face-to-face. Was it? No, well, yeah, it was 2019.
Yeah, pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, that's right. And we got over 100 people at a live event, all face-to-face. It was a very steep learning curve. We put together, or Tracey started up the Low Carb Canberra Facebook group. It's a private group. Our informal motto is information, inspiration and support. We know that it's hard doing low carb on your own, and that there are people out there who think they're the only person who is crazy enough to do this fad diet. So we're trying to reach those people. We're aiming at lay people, but we also have members who in the allied health professionals. We're trying to keep it local, so our focus is Canberra and region, but because of the miracle of the internet, we're also making connections with people in Melbourne, people in other parts of Australia, and also I think we have a few members who are from overseas. And we do, a lot of it's just repeating the message, providing a forum for people to share their stories, share recipes and ideas. So that's the inspiration bit. Every so often I'll put up a scientific paper and put it in my digestion, and I use a hashtag called Gift for Your Doctor, because I know how hard it is for people who are doing low carb and then they go to a GP who doesn't understand, and the GP looks at their LDL and has a heart attack. And so I'm trying, part of it for me is about educating people to be able to read and understand these medical concepts so that they can go armed, if needed, to talk with a doctor, and perhaps even give them information about how does my GP prescribe medications for my diabetes, which I'm reversing. So that's what Low Carb Canberra is. In 2020, because of the whole COVID schmozzle, we learned how to do it online.
Wonderful.
Steep learning curve.
If COVID taught us anything, it is how to pivot.
Yeah. And one of the wonderful things about Canberra is that we have some amazingly talented people here in Canberra. We're not a big community, but we have Richard Morris here, who's a former keto dude now studying biochemistry at ANU. Sydney is not very far away, and we have strong connections with Jess Turton and her people. We've connected with Brodie Camburn and Rowena Field in the Shoalhaven region, so they came and joined us recently in person. We also have a young lady called Tara who is a credentialed diabetes educator, and she's a pharmacist, and she's a woman living with type 1 diabetes, and she is very, very switched on. So it's great to be able to draw on the talent locally.
Now, Liz, the other thing I just wanted to draw our listeners' attention to, so you mentioned that you want to help your people or empower your people to be able to educate their doctors, but you've actually gone a step further with that and published an article in the AusDoc magazine, which our listeners may or may not know. We certainly have some doctors who listen, but the AusDoc it's Australian Doctor, we call it AusDoc for short, is a magazine publication that goes out to every GP and has very much focused on the traditional paradigm of medications heavily subsidised by drug companies, the advertising. But you got an article published in there. Tell us about that. Liz is doing a little dance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. This has been, you mentioned my superpower. At night I put my cape on, I get onto my laptop and I start writing. I'm a writer. I'm not necessarily very good at speaking, but give me a pen and paper and I'll do something. So back in 2018, I attempted to publish in Australian family physician. I wrote up a case of someone who'd reversed their metabolic syndrome. I got knocked back. So boo. I think the RACGP has a long way to go. I'm not allowed, don't know if I'm allowed to say that on.
You can say that. You can say whatever you like.
Thank you. So I turned my attention to AusDoc because I think it is important to reach my peers and my colleagues. And back in 2019, I revamped that article about reversing metabolic syndrome, and I got it published as a case study in Australian Doctor. I've since had a number of other case studies. Not all of them are to do with low carb. I don't want to be thought of as having a one-track mind.
No, you're holistic.
Absolutely. Then there was, in 2020, a fairly substantial article. It was a 2-page article that was co-authored with Ron Schweitzer, who's also a GP in Melbourne and who I met through Low Carb Down Under. And that was an article on reversing type 2 diabetes using low-carb diets. And I think AusDoc did a completely splendid job. They gave us a 2-page A3 spread, and it looked magnificent. That was their most popular therapeutic update article. And then also last year, Dr. James Mukey, Australian of the Year in 2020, came to prominence. And through the power of Facebook, I got in contact with him, and I proposed that we write an opinion piece for Australian Doctor. And its publication came soon after his tenure as Australian of the Year finished. And I guess we were trying to be a little bit outspoken there, a bit provocative perhaps, and say it's time for change with the unevidence-based Australian dietary guidelines. These guidelines are not doing anybody any favours. We can ignore the guidelines, and I use them as a really shining example of how not to eat.
Yes.
But the problem with the Australian dietary guidelines, the ones that recommend 60 teaspoons of sugar and 6 medicines a day, I'll sing it for you if you like.
Oh, yeah, go. I love a song.
60 teaspoons of sugar and 6 medicines a day, 6 medicines a day, 6 medicines a day, 60 teaspoons of sugar and 6 medicines a day, exactly as the guidelines say.
Oh, my God, you know what? We need to do Sugar the Musical.
Yep, absolutely.
Excellent.
The dietary guidelines say 50% of what we eat should come from carbohydrates. In a 2,000 kilocalorie per day diet, that's 1,000 kilocalories. Divide that by 4, that's 250 grams of carbohydrate. Approximately 50 to 60 teaspoons of sugar as a metabolic equivalent. It's crazy. And the problem is that this is what guides the delivery of food in places like hospitals, aged care facilities, childcare facilities, and prisons. One of the things that I do in my spare time is I do a clinic every so often in a local prison. And many people there are malnourished. They often have drug dependencies, they have mental health issues, they then go on lots of medication, they then develop type 2 diabetes and metabolic disease. And what do? We medicate. I do my little bit as best I can to point out the options and that we know what causes people to gain weight. We do the same thing to pigs and geese. We feed them grains and we feed them whole grains to make animals fat. What makes us think that feeding grains to people is going to do anything different? So I would like to see the dietary guidelines changed, and that's when Dr. Mukey had his moment or his year in the sunshine. I tried to get loud, as Belinda Fettke would say, get noisy.
Yes, absolutely. Be noisy with me.
Yeah, and I will continue to write, and I do continue to write, and I'm aiming to reach GPs, and I would like to do some kind of education program for GPs here in the ACT. That's the thing I'm grappling with. We know that there's at least a handful of GPs in Canberra who have got the low carb thing going. I have a colleague she's not at my practice, but she owns several practices, and she isn't, I guess, involved in training GP registrars, and some of the doctors at her practice are starting to take on the low carb perspective. So that's the thing that I would really like the next mountain to scale.
Well, hopefully with, the mounting evidence, the RACGP will be a little more forthcoming. Certainly when we did the Low Carb for Doctors conference, which was 2019, they wouldn't accredit the program as CPD, but time has passed now and low carb is no longer thought, it's no longer a fringe. It's now becoming more and more recognised as mainstream. And certainly Ron, who you mentioned, teaches medical students at Monash, which is wonderful. And the other day, Mary and I were lucky enough to present to some medical students at Deakin. So it's filtering slowly because of noisy people like you, Liz. So personally, I would like to thank you because, as I said, Liz, she does have this incredible superpower to digest these, reasonably complex, well, not reasonably, very complex scientific articles and really sort the wheat from the chaff, to use a low carb joke, and make sense of what is often a study with layers and sometimes obfuscation on purpose to make us not see the real point of the study. So Dr. Liz Fraser, gardener, writer, low carb superwoman, I would like to thank you for being on the podcast this week.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk. It's been fantastic.
You are more than welcome. Lovely. And for those of you who are in the local Canberra area, please go and join Low Carb Canberra Facebook group. You will find a wealth of information and keep up to date with all the comings and goings, events, live events in the future when we're all COVID safe, and keep on keeping on. Goodbye this week, darlings, and I will see you all next week. So, my lovely listeners, that ends this episode of Real Health and Weight Loss. I'm Dr. Lucy Burns.
And I'm Dr. Mary Barson. We're from Real Life Medicine. To contact us, please visit rlmedicine.com.
And until next time, thanks for listening.